The glass doors of Oak Creek Memorial slid open at 6:53 a.m., and Natalie Hayes stepped into fluorescent daylight that made her eyes water. 2 weeks. 14 days of quiet shifts, of watching other nurses laugh in the break room while she charted in the corner, of hands that moved with surgical precision while her jaw stayed locked tight. The trauma bay was already humming, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, monitors beeped their constant dialogue with the living and dying. She removed her jacket and hung it on the hook in the supply room, feeling the faded unit patch sewn into the lining press against her ribs. 13 years it had lived there. 13 years of fabric and thread and secrets wrapped against her heart like a second pulse. The air in Oak Creek smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, and something underneath it all that she recognized from the surgical tents in Baghdad, the metallic tang of fear. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized the trauma supplies for the morning shift, checking the defibrillator pads, counting the 14-gauge angiocath needles, verifying the epinephrine doses in the crash cart. 12 needles. 12. She counted them twice. The third time wasn't routine. It was something her body did without permission, the same muscle memory that had made her reload magazines in combat zones, the same compulsive precision that had saved 17 Marines bleeding out on a concrete floor in Fallujah. She touched the patch again through her scrubs. Nobody could see it. Nobody could know. Dr. Hargrove stood in the hallway observing her through the glass partition, his arms crossed, his face arranged in an expression of pleasant contempt. He was watching her flinch when the equipment cart slammed against the wall. He was watching her hands shake for 3 seconds before they steadied. He was watching a nervous new nurse, weak, anxious, the kind who would fold under pressure. That was what he saw. A woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back in a surgical knot, with eyes that wouldn't quite meet his, with shoulders that curved inward like she was trying to take up less space in the world. He smiled to himself and turned away, already making calculations. Already deciding what she was worth to him. Natalie finished organizing the supplies and moved to the medication refrigerator, her movements economical and practiced. She had worked as a clinical nurse at 3 other hospitals before this, never more than 18 months at each location, never long enough to explain a resume gap, never staying anywhere the old records could surface. The Oakland hospital record she had destroyed in 2013. The Phoenix position she had quietly withdrawn from in 2016. Seattle had been simple, a quiet resignation, no forwarding address. Oak Creek Memorial was supposed to be temporary too, just another 2 or 3 months while she figured out her next move, another small city, another hospital that didn't ask too many questions about the gaps between her work history. But she needed work. She needed health insurance. She needed to exist in a way that required paperwork and tax returns and the kind of documentary evidence that made a person traceable. A false identity required maintenance. It required constant care, like a living thing that would die without feeding. The morning meeting began at 7:15 a.m. in the staff conference room. Natalie sat in the back corner, her hands folded on the small clipboard she carried, her eyes on the notes she had taken during the night shift handoff. Hargrove stood at the front of the room like a conductor positioning himself before an orchestra. He wore a white coat that had been tailored to emphasize his shoulders, and a watch that caught the light whenever he moved his wrist. The watch cost more than Natalie made in 3 months. She knew this because she had learned long ago to notice everything, the cost of things, the weight of things, the way people carried themselves when they owned the room. Hargrove owned this room the way he owned the defibrillator and the blood bank and the 3 parking spots reserved under his name. "We have some new protocols this month," he announced, scanning the nurses with the clinical detachment of a man examining laboratory slides. "I trust our newer team members will pay attention." His eyes found Natalie for exactly 2 seconds. Nervous nurses make mistakes. We can't afford mistakes in trauma. The room was quiet. She didn't look up. Her pen continued moving across the paper in front of her, notes about chest tube placement, about post-operative infection prevention, about medication she had already known for 14 years of medical practice. The tremor that wanted to come into her hands didn't arrive. She had trained that out in 2003 in a field hospital outside Kandahar. Fear was data. Humiliation was information. You processed it the same way you processed vital signs. You observed, you documented, you acted. You didn't let it show on your face. The meeting ended at 7:52 a.m. Nurses scattered toward their assignments. Hargrove remained at the front of the room, texting on his phone with the absorbed intensity of a man handling urgent matters. He wasn't handling urgent matters. He was composing messages to 2 board members and noting in his personal calendar that the new hire would likely resign within 7 days. She had the look of someone running. He had seen it before, the careful movements, the compulsive checking of details, the way she never made eye contact with anyone who held authority. These were the traits of people who didn't plan to stay, which meant they were worth testing. It meant he could be a little crueler than usual and she would simply disappear rather than report him. People who were running didn't report anything. They vanished. The morning shift in the trauma bay unfolded with the rhythm of controlled chaos. 3 minor admissions, a motor vehicle collision with minor injuries, a construction accident, a fall from a scaffolding. Nothing that would require the full machinery of Oak Creek's Level 2 Trauma Center, but enough to keep the staff moving. Natalie worked alongside Marcus, a third-year resident who had been kind to her in a way that suggested he didn't yet understand that kindness made her nervous. People were kind when they wanted something, or when they expected something in return. He brought her coffee at 10:41 a.m. without being asked. She accepted it with a small nod and kept working. By 11:15 a.m., she was in the medication dispensary verifying the narcotic counts for her shift, a task that required triple-checking and documentation, the kind of precise work that other nurses skipped through or rushed. She was on her 3rd count when the intercom crackled. Incoming. Admiral Vance. 68-year-old male, post-surgical cardiac monitoring, routine admission. ETA 2 minutes. The radio static faded. Natalie continued counting. Morphine, fentanyl, hydromorphone, the bottles lined up in front of her like soldiers. Her hand stopped on the last count. She let it rest on the shelf for 3 seconds, then continued. Admiral. Navy. The name Vance was common enough. It could be any Vance. It could be a stranger. She finished the count and moved toward the patient intake area, where gurneys were already being prepared and the equipment carts were being wheeled into position. The ambulance pulled up to the bay entrance at 11:23 a.m. Paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, calling out vitals as they transferred the patient from their stretcher to the hospital bed. Natalie stood at the periphery of the trauma team, watching the transfer, watching the paramedics hand off their paperwork. She was supposed to be on lunch break, but the incoming admission had triggered the all-hands protocol. She could have stepped back. Instead, she stepped forward. The patient's face came into focus as the fluorescent lights illuminated the stretcher. 68 years old, salt and pepper hair, the kind of weathered face that came from years of command, years of responsibility, years of weight that never fully lifted. His eyes were alert and measured, the eyes of someone trained to assess threats. For 2.3 seconds, those eyes met hers as the paramedics were transferring his vitals to the monitor. In those 2.3 seconds, something passed between them that had no name, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps just the knowledge that she was looking at someone who had known Marcus. Someone who had held her son's life in his hands. Someone who had written a letter that brought Marcus home alive from Baghdad in 2009. Room 308, Hargrove said from somewhere behind her. Let's keep him comfortable. His insurance is premium. His care should reflect that. Natalie moved with the rest of the trauma team, pushing the gurney toward the elevator, her face arranged into the neutral expression she had perfected over 14 years of invisibility. Admiral Vance's hand came up as they rolled him past a mirror, and he caught his reflection, a man who had commanded carrier strikes and submarine task forces, now dependent on a network of tubes and monitors and the people pushing his stretcher. His eyes closed. When they opened again, they found Natalie once more, and this time there was something in them that looked almost like relief. Like he had been waiting for her. Like he had known she would be here. Vital stable, Marcus called out, reading the monitor. Heart rate 72, BP 128/81, O2 sat 97%. Looking good, Admiral. They rolled him into room 308 at 11:31 a.m. The bed was positioned beneath the window that faced the parking lot and the San Diego skyline beyond it. Natalie hung the fall line with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times, maybe 2,000, in places where mistakes meant body bags and flags folded into thirds. Room 308 had the same equipment as every other room on the floor: the cardiac monitor with its green trace of electrical activity, the pulse oximeter, the blood pressure cuff cycling automatically every 15 minutes. Standard protocol. Routine admission. A 68-year-old Admiral admitted for post-surgical monitoring, no complications anticipated, standard recovery timeline. She was charting his admission vitals when Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his expression one of practiced concern. He approached the bed with the swagger of a man who believed his presence was therapeutic, who had probably told himself that his charm was an asset, that his privilege was earned. He shook the Admiral's hand like they were old friends. They weren't. But Hargrove knew the value of institutional politeness. He knew that Admirals had resources. That resources meant referrals. That referrals meant money. "We're going to take excellent care of you, Admiral," Hargrove said. His eyes moved toward Natalie, standing at the medication cart. "I have to say, you're in good hands. We have a very attentive nursing staff. Even the newer ones who are still learning how we do things here." Natalie didn't look up from her charting. Her pen continued moving across the form with steady pressure. She had learned not to flinch at these moments. She had learned that dignity was often nothing more than the discipline not to react. Her jaw tightened for half a second, and then it released. Hargrove watched this small movement and smiled to himself. He was beginning to enjoy this already. The cafeteria at Oak Creek Memorial hummed with the white noise of 200 people eating lunch, the kind of soundscape where a single voice could carry like a sermon. Natalie sat at a corner table with a plastic tray, salad, tomato soup in a paper cup, turkey sandwich on wheat, and tried to disappear into the green vinyl chair. It was her 5th day. Day 5 of watching people's jaws tighten when she entered rooms. Day 5 of finding excuses to check her work twice when she knew it was already perfect. Dr. Hargrove stood at the doctor's table in the center of the cafeteria, and his voice rose above the ambient clatter like a conductor tapping his baton. "I'm taking bets, gentlemen. New nurse over there, Hayes, I give her 1 week before she quits. Anyone want to put money on it?" 20 faces turned to look at him. Then 21 pairs of eyes found her. Natalie kept her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, the exact posture of someone who hadn't heard, even though she had heard every word with the clarity of combat awareness. The facility to isolate a single voice in a crowded space was something you didn't unlearn. You maintained it like scar tissue. Hargrove's laughter rippled through the doctor's table. Someone said, 500 she makes it to Friday. Someone else said, you're on. He moved toward her table with the kind of purposeful stride that telegraphed intent. She'd seen that walk before, in training compounds and forward operating bases, the walk of someone who believed the room belonged to them. Her hands trembled slightly as he approached. Not from fear. From the effort of maintaining the mask. "How's your first week going, sweetheart?" His voice had the texture of crushed glass wrapped in velvet. "Finding our standards a little challenging." She lifted her eyes to meet his. She said nothing. This was stage 1 of humiliation or the bait. If she spoke, he won. If she didn't, he would escalate. He smiled. And then his hand moved across her tray in a swift arc, a gesture so casual it almost looked accidental. The salad bowl went first, spinning like a discus. The soup cup followed, its lid popping open mid-air, red tomato sauce cascading across the linoleum in a Jackson Pollock of carnage. Her sandwich tumbled. Her silverware clattered, the fork, the spoon, a knife that skidded 6 feet across the floor. Soup soaked into her white sneakers, cold and heavy. The cafeteria didn't just fall silent. It inhaled and held its breath. Hargrove dropped a patient chart at her feet, the pages splayed like an accusation, and spoke with the precision of a surgeon. "Pick that up, Sweetheart. That's more your speed than actual nursing. Doctors and nurses watched. Radiology techs. Lab coats. Scrubs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody laughed anymore. Natalie took one measured breath. The kind of breath you took before a procedure, before something irreversible. Before opening a man's chest in the field when the alternative was watching him die. A single tear escaped her left eye. Just one. It traced the arc of her cheekbone like it had been choreographed. She didn't blink. She didn't look away from Hargrove. She wipes the tear away with the flat of her index finger, her gaze never wavering from his, and her voice emerged quiet, steady, the voice of someone speaking from a place so deep inside themselves that it had already endured the worst the world could offer. I've stitched men back together under mortar fire, she said. You'll have to do better than that. The silence became texture. It became weight. Someone's coffee cup clinked against a saucer 3 tables away and the sound felt like a thunderclap. Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. The muscles around his mouth had gone rigid. His left hand clenched into a fist and then released, clenched and released, like he was learning for the first time that not everyone could be broken with words and a lunch tray. Natalie knelt. She moved with tactical efficiency that was so practiced, so automatic, that it looked less like picking up a spill and more like securing a perimeter. Every page of the patient chart went back into sequence. She didn't let them scatter. Her hands worked with the precision of someone who had organized medical supplies in cargo holds and on stretchers rolling toward medevac helicopters. Every item on the floor, the silverware, the napkins, the salvageable parts of lunch, went into a careful stack. She stood, held the chart out to Hargrove without meeting his eyes again, and walked out of the cafeteria without another word. 2 nurses whispered near the vending machines as she passed. Later, they would tell people what they thought they'd seen in those moments when she was collecting the pages, the way her hands moved, the muscle memory precision of someone who had been trained for exactly this kind of crisis, not the crisis of spilled soup but the crisis of maintaining order when everything was falling apart. They would use words like tactical and military and neither of them would quite understand why. But they would remember. Dr. Hargrove stood motionless in the center of the cafeteria, the patient chart in his hand, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, the sensation of being diminished in front of an audience. His face had gone the color of hospital walls. He walked back to his table without sitting down, excused himself, and moved toward the stairwell with the deliberate pace of someone who needed privacy to think. By 2 that afternoon, he had made 3 phone calls. The first was to Marcus Denning, a board member with 43 years in healthcare administration and a mortgage so large it required 3 generations of Denning family employment to service. Marcus, we might have a hiring issue. The new nurse, Natalie Hayes, she presented well in the interview, but I'm seeing some concerning behavioral patterns. Insubordination. Possible anger management issues. Nothing documented yet, but I wanted to flag it before it becomes a liability. Denning said he would look into it. The second call was to HR, requesting Natalie's full hiring file, background check, reference letters, medical certification records. He phrased it casually. Just want to make sure everything's aligned with our protocols. The third call was to his accountant, a conversation conducted in the language of money moving very quietly. I need to accelerate the timeline. How much can we move in the next 30 days without drawing audit attention? That evening, Natalie entered room 308 during her usual rounds. The Admiral was awake, reading something on a tablet, the blue light of the screen illuminating his weathered face. She'd been avoiding this room, checking the schedule, hoping for any shift that didn't put her in front of him. But here she was, and here he was, and she could either run from every answer or face them head-on. His eyes moved from the tablet to her badge when she approached his bedside. His entire body went still, the way a predator goes still when it recognizes a kindred species. Nurse Hayes, he read from her badge, his voice careful and pitched low. San Diego. She nodded, maintaining her composure, moving through the standard checks with practiced efficiency. She adjusted his cardiac monitor leads, checked the fall line, logged his vitals on the rolling computer station. "How are your pain levels today, Admiral? You have a son in the service." It wasn't a question. His voice was different now, not a command, but a statement of fact. Her hands froze on the fall line. Her eyes moved to his. The mast slipped for just a moment, long enough for him to see the answer before she could speak it. "How did you?" "You have the look," he said quietly. "We always know. The way a parent of a service member carries something in their shoulders. Something added that wasn't there before." He set the tablet aside with deliberate slowness. "Tell me about him." She glanced at the door. No one in the hallway. The shift change would be in 40 minutes. She had time, but not much. "Marcus. Marine Corps. He served under a CO named Vance in Baghdad, 2009. The commander wrote a letter that..." She swallowed hard. "That brought him home alive." The Admiral's face changed. Something shifted behind his eyes, like someone recognizing a voice they hadn't heard in decades. "Marcus Hayes. Extraction from the safe house en route Irish." He sat up slightly, searching her face for confirmation. That was a Navy SEAL operation embedded with Marines. The team leader was... He stopped. Started again. The team leader was a woman. Senior chief. They erased her after. Classified. He nodded slowly, understanding moving across his face like recognition. "That was you." Natalie's finger touched her lips. The universal gesture for silence. The gesture of someone who has been trained to keep secrets that belong to the government, to the Navy, to the kind of operations that never made it into official records or history books. "My son doesn't know I'm here," she said quietly. "No one can know." "Understood." The Admiral lay back against his pillows, but his eyes never left hers. "But nurse, thank you. For all of it. For bringing him home." She nodded once and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Hayes. You're stronger than you look." She didn't turn around. "I'm exactly as strong as I look, Admiral. The mistake is what people see when they're not paying attention." That night, after her shift ended and the hospital settled into the fluorescent-lit quiet of evening rounds, Dr. Hargrove pulled Admiral Vance's updated chart and saw every entry, every note, every vital sign logged by a single name, Natalie Hayes. His hands went cold, then hot. He sat at his office desk in the semi-darkness and understood, for the first time, that he had made a strategic error. He pulled out his encrypted email and typed a message to the hospital CFO, "We need to discuss the new nurse's access to high-profile patients. She seems to be inserting herself into cases outside her rotation. I have concerns about protocol deviation." Then he started a file on his personal computer, not the hospital network. Documenting things. Building a narrative. Finding the minor discrepancies in her charting, a blood pressure reading logged 6 minutes after she recorded it, a medication timestamp that was off by 2 minutes, and magnifying them into evidence of carelessness. He was building a case. And he was just getting started. Segment 3 of 5. Evening rounds moved like a current through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial. Natalie pushed the medication cart down the third-floor hallway, her rubber-soled shoes padding softly against the antiseptic scrubbed tile. Room 308 waited at the end of the corridor, and she had learned by her second week not to approach it with anything resembling urgency. The Admiral had stable vitals. Routine monitoring was the protocol. Dr. Hargrove had made that abundantly clear in this morning's briefing, his tone suggesting she should be grateful for the simplicity of the task. She knocked twice before entering. The room held that peculiar hospital stillness, the soft hiss of compressed air through oxygen tubing, the distant percussion of the heart monitor keeping its measured time. Admiral Vance lay propped at a 30-degree angle, his uniform jacket folded across the back of the visitor's chair. He was reading a classified briefing document when she entered, and she watched as his eyes traveled up from the page to her face. The color drained from his features. Not dramatically. not the theatrical shock of recognition that might alert someone standing outside the glass. But a deep, complete stillness came over him. Like a man who had just seen a ghost walk into his hospital room wearing hospital scrubs and a name badge. His hand lowered the briefing document with precision. Movement controlled. Deliberate. Natalie's face remained neutral. She approached the forestand, checked the saline bag, made a note on the chart with a pen that clicked once, a small, sharp sound in the silence. Routine. Every motion choreographed to suggest nothing unusual existed between them. Nurse, the Admiral said. His voice carried the weight of the ranking officer who had commanded Marines under fire in the Anbar province. Measured. Careful. Your name tag says Hayes. She did not look at him directly. She adjusted the foretubing with methodical precision, checking the connection where needle met port. That's correct, sir. Overseas service. The question came gently. But it was not a question. It was a test of what she could acknowledge in a place where walls had ears and documentation had consequences. Natalie's jaw tightened. She lifted her eyes to meet his for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to see the affirmation, not long enough for anyone monitoring surveillance cameras to identify it as anything but routine eye contact. No, sir, she said aloud. Then she looked away. Then she checked his heart rate on the monitor and made another note. The chart documented what any nurse might document. Nothing more. The Admiral's breathing had shifted. She heard it in the slight hitch as he drew air, in the way his hand gripped the blanket's edge. He understood. The 13 years that lay between the Baghdad extraction and this hospital room had compressed into a single moment of recognition. He knew exactly who stood at the foot of his bed. And he understood, with the tactical precision of a man trained to read encrypted communications and classified threats, that she could not speak. That her presence here was not accidental. That whatever had brought Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, the woman who had pulled 12 wounded Marines from an ambush that was never officially documented, to work as a nurse in San Diego carried weight he could not ask about in this place. She finished her rounds in room 308 in under 4 minutes. By the time she closed the door behind her, her heart rate had returned to baseline. But something had shifted. The Admiral knew. And in knowing, he had become either her greatest asset or the element most likely to expose her. Natalie was halfway down the stairwell when her phone vibrated against her ribs. Text message. Unknown number. Need to see you. Now. My office. The message came from Dr. Hargrove's administrative assistant. Natalie climbed back up the stairs and made her way to the second floor, where the executive corridor smelled like expensive coffee and something chemical, air freshener meant to conceal the fundamental staleness of recirculated hospital atmosphere. Hargrove sat behind a desk that had cost more than her annual salary. 3 framed photos occupied the credenza behind him, Hargrove receiving an award from the hospital board, Hargrove at a black-tie fundraiser with a woman who was not his wife, Hargrove standing in front of a yacht. Power, displayed like medical instruments on a surgical tray. He gestured to the chair opposite him without looking up from his computer. I've been reviewing your assignments, he said. His fingers moved across the keyboard in rapid bursts. Click. 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 It's come to my attention that you may be better suited for the night shift. Emergency department rotation. We need consistency there. Natalie said nothing. She had learned that silence often frustrated men like Hargrove more than argument. Argument was a conversation. Silence was a wall. Your work with Admiral Vance has been adequate, he continued, but I think it's important that you experience a broader range of clinical scenarios. The night shift in trauma is where nurses really prove themselves. Unless you have objections. He finally turned to look at her, his expression pleasant. Almost fatherly. The expression a man wears when he is absolutely certain he has already won. No objections, Doctor, Natalie said. Excellent. He swiveled back to his monitor. Starting tomorrow. You'll be paired with Rachel Chen on the weekday nights. She's been here for 8 years. You can learn from her experience. He typed something, hit return. You're dismissed. The moment she left his office, Natalie knew what he was doing. Removal from Admiral Vance's care team. Night shift, where the documentation would be scrutinized more carefully, where every minor delay or procedural deviation could be highlighted and recorded. Where she would be separated from the Admiral and prevented from monitoring his condition. It was not crude. It was competent. Hargrove was not trying to break her through public humiliation anymore. He was constructing a framework of administrative decisions that would make her absence seem reasonable when the moment came. But he had not anticipated what was already in motion. 45 minutes later, Dr. Hargrove placed a call from his private line to board member Richardson. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Hargrove's voice remained smooth, conversational, the tone of one professional calling a favor from another. He had covered for Richardson 2 years prior, a mistaken diagnosis in cardiology, a patient transferred to another hospital, the paperwork carefully adjusted so the mistake never appeared in the formal record. Richardson owed him. "We have a performance issue with a new hire," Hargrove said. "I need you to fast-track a formal review. Background verification concerns. She may not be credentialed properly." He listened to Richardson's response, made a small sound of acknowledgement. "No, nothing dramatic. But it needs documentation. I want it initiated immediately." Another pause. "Thank you. I appreciate it." The second call went to the state licensing board. This time, Hargrove used language that was deliberately vague. Credential verification issues. Questions about prior employment history. A nurse whose professional background did not align entirely with her stated experience. Nothing specific. Nothing actionable. Just enough to trigger a standard investigation. Just enough to create a paper trail that would lead them to ask harder questions about someone whose entire identity was manufactured to be perfect, flawless references, a nursing degree from a program that existed, a work history that checked out but was hollow at its core. By 6 p.m., an external investigator from a private firm specializing in healthcare credential verification had been contracted. Her name was Sarah Dubois. She was thorough. Methodical. She had spent 15 years rooting out fraudulent credentials in medical institutions, and she understood that the smallest inconsistency, a gap in dates, a reference who was too eager to confirm details, a program that barely remembered an applicant, could indicate something significant. She would pull Natalie's employment records and find them too clean. A background that began 14 years ago with no explanation for what came before. Nursing school documents that were genuine but felt scripted. References from colleagues who were real but whose endorsements came through with the precision of rehearsed testimony. Dubois would sit across from Hargrove the next morning and deliver her preliminary assessment with professional objectivity. Something's off. Her credentials are valid on their surface, but the construction feels deliberate. Whoever created this identity knew how to do it right. That's not amateur work. Hargrove would smile. Meanwhile, on the evening of Natalie's reassignment to night shift, she stood in room 308 conducting her final rounds for Admiral Vance. The covering physician for the evening, a resident named Dr. Patterson, had already come and gone. Routine vitals, he had noted. Heart rate 72. Blood pressure stable. All systems normal. But Natalie's eyes had caught something Patterson missed. The Admiral's overnight vitals from the previous evening showed a pattern. Heart rate variability increasing by 3 to 5 beats per minute each hour between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. Not dramatic enough to trigger an alarm. Not enough to deviate from normal parameters. But a pattern nonetheless. The kind of pattern that meant something was shifting beneath the surface. She mentioned it to Patterson as he was leaving. His overnight rate showed some variability, she said. Worth monitoring. Just a notation. Patterson glanced at his notes, shrugged. Dr. Hargrove says routine monitoring is sufficient. He's stable. The resident moved on to the next patient. But Natalie charted it anyway. She documented the heart rate trend, the specific numbers, her clinical observation that the pattern bore watching. Her handwriting was meticulous. Her notes were precise. She created a paper trail that existed independent of Dr. Hargrove's instructions, a record that would prove she had seen something others had missed, that she had performed her duty exactly as a trained military medical specialist would perform it, with attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. 3 hours later, the Admiral buzzed his nurse call button. The night shift nurse, not Natalie, responded and found him sitting upright, his breathing slightly elevated. "Just checking," he said when she asked if he needed anything. "Everything's fine." But his eyes, when he spoke those words, looked toward the hallway where Natalie Hayes would no longer be standing on evening rounds. He understood that her removal from his care was not coincidence. And in understanding that, he began to understand something else entirely, that the person Dr. Hargrove had selected as his target was not actually someone whose career could be easily destroyed. She was someone whose very presence was a security classification walking through a hospital in scrubs. 3 days later, the morning light moved across room 308 in long rectangles, and Natalie pushed the medication cart past the glass partition, her eyes catching on the Admiral without breaking stride. She wasn't supposed to look. The night shift had ended 2 hours ago, and Hargrove's reassignment had been clear, ER rotation, not cardiac. But her body had trained her to read rooms the way other people read mail. The Admiral sat upright against the pillows. His skin had taken on the color of wet concrete. His jugular veins distended like rope pulled taut beneath his throat, and his breathing came in shallow pulls, each one a fraction of what it should have been. Natalie's hand stilled on the cart. She knew that look the way a firefighter knows smoke. The pericardium, the sac surrounding his heart, was filling with fluid. His own heart was drowning him from the inside. Cardiac tamponade. 5 minutes, maybe less. She turned the cart toward the stairwell, then stopped. Muscle memory was one thing. Watching a man die while you had the skill to save him was something else entirely. She reversed direction. The door to room 308 swung open without announcement. Dr. Hargrove stood at the bedside with 2 residents, his hand gesturing dismissively at the cardiac monitor. "His pressure's acceptable. We don't emergency page for every blip on the screen. The cardiologist is 20 minutes out. Until then, we wait." "His heart is drowning," Natalie said. Hargrove's head snapped toward her. The residents froze. The Admiral's eyes moved to the doorway, and for just a moment, recognition flickered across his face. Senior Chief, the woman who'd held him together in a safe house in Baghdad, now standing in scrubs in a San Diego hospital room. "You are not on this case, Nurse Hayes." Hargrove's voice dropped into the register that promised consequences. "Leave. Now." Natalie looked at the Admiral. His lips were turning the color of old bruises. His fingers gripping the bed rail trembled, not from weakness, but from his body trying to compensate for a heart that couldn't pump against the pressure building around it. The monitor showed a heart rate climbing past 130, blood pressure collapsing. He was minutes away from cardiovascular collapse. She hit the code button with the heel of her hand. The sound was sharp, decisive, a single loud alarm that made the residents jump. Before Hargrove could process what had happened, Natalie was moving toward the crash cart, her hands already reaching for what she needed. A 14-gauge spinal needle, steady, precise. Her voice cut through the chaos like she was calling orders through gunfire. "Get me a syringe. Prep his xiphoid process. Now." "Security!" Hargrove was screaming, his face the color of arterial blood. "Remove her immediately." But the entire nursing staff had crowded the glass partition, watching. They could see what Hargrove couldn't see, or wouldn't. They could see the Admiral's skin mottling with cyanosis, the desperate gasping for air, the way his fingers were clawing at his own chest. They had watched Natalie for 3 days, and they knew precision when they saw it. She palpated the xiphoid process at the base of his sternum, found the landmark with fingers that had done this under mortar fire in a basement 20 miles from Fallujah. She inserted the needle at a 45-degree angle, driving it upward toward the pericardial space. The residents held their breath. The only sound was the hiss of the needle moving through tissue, the soft crackle of the Admiral's breathing. Then the resistance broke. She pulled back on the syringe plunger. Fluid rushed into the barrel. Blood-tinged, dark with the pressure that had been suffocating his heart. 60 milliliters. 70. She kept aspirating, kept the needle steady, kept her breathing mechanical, and even while Hargrove's voice dissolved into inarticulate rage. The Admiral gasped, a deep, desperate breath as his lungs suddenly had room to expand. His skin color shifted from gray to pink. The monitor's rhythm steadied. His oxygen saturation climbed, 88, 91, 95. Sinus rhythm. Page cardiology, Natalie said quietly, stepping back from the bed. Tell them tamponade is resolved. They can take their time now. Security arrived like storm fronts, 2 officers in dark uniforms, and they escorted her from the room with hands on her elbows that were professional and immovable. The nursing staff parted to let her through. No one spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the monitor behind them, and the echo of her boots on linoleum that felt like applause. 3 hours later, Natalie sat in the director's office, and the silence had weight to it. Director Morrison shuffled papers with the energy of someone performing the ritual of management. Behind him, a folder lay open. She didn't need to read it to know what it contained. Your credentials, Morrison began, his voice careful and exhausted. There are discrepancies. The state licensing board has contacted us regarding prior employment verification. Dr. Hargrove has filed a complaint regarding scope of practice violation, and we've brought in an external investigator. I understand, Natalie said. We have no choice but to suspend your license pending investigation. This is standard procedure when there are credential irregularities. Effective immediately, you are on administrative leave. Your badge and access key, please. Natalie unclipped her badge from her scrub pocket and set it on the desk. The small plastic rectangle with her photo looked like something from someone else's life. She stood, walked to the door, and didn't look back. The atrium was busy with the kind of controlled chaos that hospitals ran on. Nurses rushed between stations. Visitors moved through in slow clusters. Somewhere in the building, Admiral Vance's heart was beating with a rhythm that wouldn't have existed if she'd followed protocol, if she'd waited for the cardiologist, if she'd let Hargrove's authority matter more than his patient's life. She'd saved him. And now she was erased. Her car was in the parking garage, exactly where she'd left it that morning. She drove home in silence, took the exit toward the VA hospital without making a conscious decision to, found herself sitting in the waiting room before she'd fully acknowledged that she was coming. The VA hospital was full of her people. Veterans in wheelchairs, prosthetic legs gleaming under fluorescent lights, men whose wounds she recognized in the way other people recognized family photos. A woman with a traumatic brain injury stare. A man whose military bearing hadn't survived whatever he'd been through. This was where soldiers came when there was nowhere else to go. Natalie checked in at the desk, told the receptionist she needed psychiatric evaluation, anxiety management, maybe some sleep medication. The words came out like she believed them. Maybe she did. The receptionist handed her a form and told her to have a seat. She sat surrounded by men who'd been through worse, invisible in a crowd of people who understood invisible. In room 308, across town, Admiral Vance would be sleeping soundly, his heart intact because she'd broken every protocol Hargrove could throw at her. And here she sat, asking for medication she didn't need, waiting for permission to exist in the system again. This was her lowest point. Not the humiliation in the cafeteria, not Hargrove's escalating attacks, not even the suspension. This was it, the moment when erasing herself again seemed like the path of least resistance. The moment when staying disappeared felt safer than fighting to be seen. Then the glass doors exploded inward. The sound came first, rotor wash, deafening, continuous, the bass note of helicopter blades cutting through air. The pressure wave knocked papers off the reception desk. Everyone in the waiting room jerked upright, startled into sudden alertness the way only people trained in combat zones could be. Natalie's head snapped toward the windows. Through the glass, she could see them, 2 Navy helicopters, their blades still rotating, landing gear settling against the parking lot asphalt. They'd landed hard and hot, emergency protocol, like they were touching down in a combat zone. 2 full SEAL teams exited in formation, dress blues, weapons precision in every movement. Their boots hit the tile floor in synchronized rhythm as they moved through the entrance, boot, 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 40 men moving like a single organism. The receptionist stood up, her voice shaking, "You can't, the waiting room is for." The team leader's voice cut through the chaos like steel through silk. "Senior Chief Hayes. Now." Every veteran in the room came to attention. Natalie rose slowly, her legs moving on their own. The crowd of warriors parted without being told, clearing a path, understanding what they were witnessing without needing explanation. Then Marcus stepped forward. Her son. Marine Corps dress uniform, the kind he only wore for ceremonies. His face was wet with tears, and his voice broke when he spoke, "Mom. Senior Chief, they need you." Natalie's world narrowed to a single point. She couldn't speak. Couldn't move. The man beside Marcus wore the rank insignia of a naval commander, and he was holding a file, and his voice had the weight of official authority when he addressed her in front of 40 witnesses and every staff member Oak Creek Memorial had sent over in their own vehicles when they saw the helicopters land. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes," he began, and the room held its breath. Her name. Her rank. Spoken aloud. Public. Permanent. The commander opened the file, and his voice continued with the cadence of ceremony, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Combat Medical Operations in Fallujah. Combat Medical Operations in Ramadi. Each medal was its own sentence. Each one a layer of proof. Nurses gasped. Someone whispered a name. Dr. Hargrove pushed toward the front of the gathering, confusion turning to something darker. "Navy Cross," the commander said, and the entire room went silent. "For extracting 12 wounded Marines under sustained fire en route Irish, Baghdad, March 2009, in direct violation of medical evacuation protocols." She'd broken every rule that day too. She'd gone into fire when the standing order was to wait. She'd loaded Marines into a transport under mortar that had killed 2 soldiers before and 3 after, and she'd gotten 12 men home alive. The next officer stepped forward, Navy intelligence insignia on his collar. Intelligence Star. For the operation that never happened. The classified CIA asset extraction from a safe house compound in the Uladhamia district. Senior Chief Hayes and her 7-person team were ordered to disappear following successful completion of that operation. You were erased from every database by order of Naval Intelligence. Your identity was constructed, your service record buried, your name removed from every document. You were officially never there. Dr. Hargrove's mouth opened. His face had gone the color of old paper. Your attempt to forge and manipulate Senior Chief Hayes's records, the intelligence officer continued, turning to Hargrove, triggered a classified security flag. The investigation that followed uncovered healthcare fraud totaling $1.2 million. Kickback schemes. Phantom procedures. Equipment orders inflated to generate personal profit. 2 FBI agents stepped into position, 1 on each side of Hargrove. The handcuffs were silver and inevitable. Dr. Richard Hargrove, you are under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, unlawful interference with a classified federal protection program, and obstruction of federal investigation. The ratchet sound of the cuffs closing was louder than it should have been. Everything was louder. The agents read him his rights in voices that carried through the atrium. Hospital staff watched with the kind of satisfaction that came from witnessing justice move at something faster than bureaucratic speed. Hargrove's face cycling through disbelief, rage, desperation, all the colors of a man who'd believed his power was absolute until he discovered it had limits. The SEAL commander turned back to Natalie, raised his hand, and delivered the salute that meant respect between warriors, fist to chest, then extended outward. "Admiral Vance requests your presence, Senior Chief. He wants to thank the woman who saved his life twice, once in Baghdad, when she walked into fire for him, and once last week, when she broke protocol to keep him breathing. The room erupted. Not chaos. Applause. Veterans in wheelchairs clapping. Nurses wiping tears. Marcus moving forward and pulling her into a hug that felt like 13 years of waiting finally releasing. And Natalie stood in the center of it, visible, named, claimed, finally allowed to take up the space in the world that she'd been erased from. Not all heroes wear capes, some wear scrubs. The next morning, Natalie sat in a folding chair at the VA hospital on Rosecrans Street, surrounded by the quiet suffering of men and women who'd seen what she'd seen. Burned hands. Missing limbs. Eyes that looked past walls into distances only combat zones held. She clutched a clipboard with paperwork for anxiety medication she didn't need, just cover, just something to explain her presence in this waiting room without saying the actual words, I am classified. I am erased. I am trying to exist as someone who doesn't officially exist. A veteran in a wheelchair 3 seats over recognized the posture before he recognized the face, shoulders back, jaw set, hand steady despite everything. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. That was the code. The clinic ran behind schedule. 11:44 a.m. She'd been waiting 32 minutes when her phone vibrated once. A single text from a number she'd deleted from her contacts 12 years ago, stand by. The rotor wash hit the parking lot like a physical force. The glass doors of the hospital, not the VA clinic, but Oak Creek Memorial 6 blocks away, exploded inward with a pressure wave that sent papers spiraling. 2 Navy helicopters descended on the parking lot, their engines screaming that sound only combat pilots knew, controlled chaos, precision descent, this is not a drill. The UH-60M Blackhawks touched down with synchronized finality. Rotors spinning. Dust and papers lifting like an echo of every desert she'd ever stood in. The lobby fell silent. That was the moment, that exact moment when the air pressure changed and everyone knew something was happening that exceeded normal protocol. The doors burst open again, and they came through like they owned the atmosphere around them. 12 SEALs in dress blues, not tactical gear, and that choice meant something specific. This was official, this was public, this was a message being delivered to everyone in the building. They moved through the ER with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, boots on tile in perfect cadence, and the lead operator, petty officer first class with a beard regulation long and eyes that had seen things, stepped up to the nursing desk. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Not a question. A command. Not a request. An interrogative statement that meant they already knew she was here, they knew exactly who she was, and they'd just breached a hospital's airspace to retrieve her. The ER froze. The nurses froze. The attending physicians froze. The waiting room patients stopped moving. The only sound was the distant rotors still turning, still maintaining position, still saying we are here for her. And then a voice, one voice, trembling, cut through the silence. Mom, Senior Chief, they need you. Marcus. Her son, her baby, her reason for everything, stepping forward in navy dress blues that meant he'd known. He'd known this whole time. His eyes were wet. His voice cracked on the rank like he'd rehearsed it 100 times and still couldn't make it sound casual. Mom, they need you. Natalie's hands trembled as she stood. Not from fear. From the weight of 13 years of invisibility lifting like a helicopter taking flight. Her son was looking at her like she was the person she'd been, not the person she'd pretended to be. Her son knew. Her son had always known, and they'd just brought the entire United States Navy to confirm it in public. The SEAL commander stepped aside, and a file was pressed into her hands, a thick folder with top-secret markings visible even from the hallway. Her fingers moved on their own. Muscle memory of taking orders, receiving intelligence, processing briefings. She opened it, and there was Admiral Vance's handwriting, the signature of a man who'd survived because she'd refused to let him die in a Baghdad safe house when insurgents had his position bracketed on 3 sides. His words, the woman in that room is a legend. She saved my life on March 14, 2009, under fire in Jolan District. She saved my life again this week in San Diego, and I would trust her with my command, my family, and my country. She deserves the truth. She deserves to come home." The SEAL commander's voice carried through the atrium, not shouting, not needing to. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Navy Cross for extracting 12 wounded Marines under fire in Baghdad. And the Intelligence Star for the operation that never happened. 3 medals. Each one a beat of her heart. Each one 13 years of official denial crystallizing into public acknowledgement. 2 Bronze Stars. Navy Cross. And the Intelligence Star, the rarest, the most classified, the one that meant a covert operation had been so sensitive that erasing her from every database had been the cost of national security. And then, over her shoulder, she heard the handcuffs. 2 FBI agents walked Dr. Hargrove past the assembled crowd in dress suits that meant federal law, meant jurisdiction beyond hospitals, meant consequences that extended further than a medical board. His face was the color of institutional tile, white, blank, erased just like she'd been erased, except she was being claimed back and he was being taken out. The lead agent's voice was low but clear. "Dr. Marcus Hargrove, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, conspiracy, identity fabrication, attempted forgery of classified government records, and obstruction of justice. Your attempt to forge Senior Chief Hayes' personnel file triggered a classified alert protocol maintained by the Department of Defense. That alert connected to a federal investigation. That investigation uncovered for years of phantom billing procedures, shell company contracts, and kickback schemes totaling $847,000. Hargrove tried to speak. His mouth moved. No sound came out. He'd spent 12 days constructing her downfall, and in doing so, he'd tripped an invisible wire that had been waiting since her name was deleted from every official record, a failsafe designed by people who understood that heroes sometimes came home and needed protecting from exactly the kind of predator who'd been operating inside institutions. The hospital director appeared, her face ashen, her hand shaking as she approached Natalie directly in front of everyone. "Senior Chief, Ms. Hayes, I." Her voice cracked. "I apologize. Unconditionally. Your suspension is lifted, effective immediately. Your position here is secure. Anything you need." Board member Richardson, who'd expedited the investigation at Hargrove's request, had already left the building. His resignation letter was being typed as the FBI took Hargrove past the ER staff. His involvement was a liability now, a stain, a reminder that even people in positions of power could be manipulated by a predator who understood institutional weakness better than he understood medicine. The external investigator who'd been pressured to find problems in Natalie's file sat in an FBI interview room downtown, explaining how Hargrove had called him daily with suggestions, how he'd been offered a medical supply contract in exchange for finding discrepancies, how he realized too late that he was part of something bigger than a background check. By end of week, his firm would lose every healthcare contract they held. Due diligence. Consequences. The invisible wire had teeth. Marcus was beside her now, and she let him embrace her in front of all of them, in front of the nurses, the doctors, the patients waiting in the lobby who'd just witnessed a court-martial in a hospital atrium. "I never knew," Marcus whispered against her shoulder. "All those years you said you were Navy admin, I never knew. And then your CO called me, and he explained, and his voice cracked again. I always wondered why you were afraid." She held her son like she'd held him when he came home from Baghdad, when she'd finally been able to touch him again after 11 months of operational silence. She held him like he was still the 10-year-old who'd watched her leave in dress blues, confused about why Mom had to go to a place he couldn't talk about. Admiral Vance was being wheeled down from his room on the 3rd floor. Recovered. Alert. Moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose chest had been reopened by a needle and whose heart was still learning to trust again. When he saw her, he struggled to stand despite the protests from 2 nurses and a physical therapist. His leg shook. He didn't care. He rendered a salute, formal, military, the kind of salute that transcended rank because it came from someone who understood what it meant to be brought back from death by a woman who'd spent 13 years pretending to be someone else. Natalie returned it with muscle memory she'd hidden for over a decade. Her arm came up smooth. Her posture shifted. For just that moment, she was visible as exactly what she was. The senior chief saved my life in a Baghdad safe house when my convoy was ambushed, Admiral Vance said, his voice steady despite the still running fluid into his arm. She carried me 200 yards under sniper fire while taking rounds in her left shoulder and still keeping a compress on my wound. And last week she did it again with a needle and 60 seconds of courage. That's how many people in this hospital know what they witnessed through the glass during the pericardiocentesis. He looked at the nursing staff directly. That wasn't recklessness. That was combat precision. That was a warrior working. The SEAL team presented her with the file, not just Admiral Vance's request, but her actual service record. Declassified by special order. 7 pages detailing operations she hadn't been able to acknowledge, missions that had cost people, extractions under fire, the kind of work that got erased because the world wasn't ready to know it existed. And beneath the file, wrapped in military-issue tissue, was her uniform. The Navy working uniform Type 3 in digital camouflage, the rank insignia still bright on the collar, the chest still empty of the medals that were about to be reinstated. She touched the fabric like it might dissolve. Someone in the crowd, one of the young nurses, asked the question that hung in the air, "Why did you come back as a nurse? Why didn't you fight the erasure?" Natalie was quiet for a long moment. Her voice, when she spoke, was the voice of someone who'd made peace with sacrifice. Because the men and women who serve still need care. I couldn't do it in uniform anymore because the mission required my name to disappear. So I found another way to serve. I came back as someone nobody recognized so nobody could hurt the people I was trying to protect. She was led to her locker in the staff area. The jacket, the one she'd worn even in San Diego summer heat, the one Hargrove had mocked for looking like military surplus, was retrieved from the bottom, folded neatly by whoever had cleaned out her temporary space. She held it and felt the weight of it, the heft of 13 years of hidden history. Her hands trembled as she unstitched the faded unit patch from the inside lining. Her fingers found the needle marks she'd put there herself, the careful stitches she'd maintained through deployments and separations, and a whole new life built on carefully constructed lies. The patch was faded almost past recognition, but the emblem was still visible, her unit, her brothers, her identity that couldn't exist in any official database. She pinned it to her uniform beside the medals that were being mounted as she stood there. 2 Bronze Stars. Navy Cross. Intelligence Star. And now the unit patch, visible at last after 13 years of darkness. Marcus saw it and recognition dawned, sharp and clear. That's why you always wore that jacket. Even in summer. Even when I asked why you weren't cold. I thought, he couldn't finish. He was looking at his mother like she'd just materialized from a classified briefing, because in a way, she had. The FBI provided an update to the hospital director, who passed it along to Natalie in the privacy of an office with the door closed. Hargrove's fraud ring involved for other doctors and 2 medical supply companies. Shell company contracts worth $847,000. Phantom procedures billed to Medicare totaling $340,000. Kickbacks laundered through corporate accounts. His network was being dismantled in real time, federal agents moving simultaneously across San Diego, Los Angeles, and Riverside County. His medical license was being permanently revoked pending criminal conviction. His assets were being seized. He would never practice medicine again. He would never hold institutional power again. The invisible wire had executed its function perfectly. 6 months later, Natalie worked at Oak Creek Memorial as head of trauma services. She trained staff in combat casualty care techniques, tactical hemorrhage control, emergency field procedures, the kind of medical knowledge that came from having saved lives in places where ambulances couldn't reach. Her uniform hung on her bedroom wall beside the unit patch, both finally in daylight after 13 years of hiding. Sunlight streamed through the window and caught the metals of her medals, turning them into small constellations of color. Marcus visited every Sunday. They finally talked about Baghdad, about the things neither could say before. About the extraction. About why she'd disappeared. About what it meant to come home but stay erased. About the weight of knowing things the world would never know. They sat on her porch in the San Diego evening, and for the first time in 13 years, there were no more secrets between them. Someone, she suspected one of the nurses whose confidence had been restored by Hargrove's arrest, sent her a photo in a manila envelope with no return address. She opened it and found Dr. Hargrove behind a folding table in a strip mall parking lot. A banner reading supplemental insurance, low rates in faded lettering. His face aged a decade in 6 months. Passers-by walking past without looking. His presence so diminished that he'd become invisible, the way he'd tried to make her invisible, except nobody was coming to resurrect him. She studied the photo for a long moment, felt nothing but distant pity, and filed it away. Karma didn't need her to watch it work. It just needed time. Admiral Vance returned for a follow-up appointment and brought his full staff. He insisted Natalie receive a formal commendation ceremony that Oak Creek Memorial hosted in the main atrium, the same space where she'd been suspended, now filled with local news cameras and veteran organizations. The hospital director opened the ceremony by publicly acknowledging the fraud investigation and Natalie's role in exposing the billing scheme through her meticulous charting. During the ceremony, a young nurse approached tentatively. She had the look of someone carrying doubt, the posture of someone who'd been told she wasn't enough. "Dr. Hargrove told me I'd never make it here," she said quietly. "He said I was too soft." Natalie recognized the look in her eyes. She'd seen it in mirrors for 13 years. "Let me tell you about being soft," she said. "The strongest thing I ever did was keep stitching wounds when artillery shook the building. The bravest thing was coming back as a nurse when I could have stayed hidden. The scariest thing was letting people see who I actually was. Don't let anyone define your strength. Your softness is your precision. Use it." The young nurse nodded, stood straighter, and Natalie watched her understand something shift in her own estimation of herself. The closing shot, if anyone had been filming, would have shown Natalie's jacket on the wall of her bedroom, the unit patch finely visible in daylight, and a new plaque beside it mounted in a simple wooden frame, Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, Navy Cross, still serving. If you know someone who's quiet, who moves with precision, who's seen more than they can say, share this. And if you know someone who's pretending to be less than they are just to survive in a system that wasn't built for them, tell them this: your real name matters. Your real service matters. Your real self matters. Subscribe for more stories of heroes working in the dark, and comment, what would you risk to be visible again?